and his proposals are dutifully approved by a compliant parliament or rigged public referendums. This is very much what happened to democratic Russia. Putin was a powerful Russian politician, and he passed a bunch of constitutional amendments that soon made him the only powerful Russian politician. This sort of thing doesn't really happen in well-established democracies, however, with strong political parties and free speech and a free press and all of that. And this is just because in more mature democracies, the amount of approval that you need to pass constitutional amendments is generally quite high, and it's generally quite difficult to get a high level of public consensus in favor of dramatic political reform in a free society. And so for that reason, I'm going to rank this one as low in terms of democratic danger. If anything, I think that far more democracies these days suffer from the fact that it is incredibly difficult to pass even the most mild, common sense constitutional amendments that might actually help strengthen democracy. All right, democratic paradox number 2 is Lindsey Graham syndrome. This is a concept I learned about from a very good podcast called The Corruption of Lindsey Graham, put out by my pals at The Bulwark. Basically, the story here is that there is a famous Republican senator in the US named Lindsey Graham. I'm sure you've heard of him. And he ran for president against Donald Trump in 2016. And just to summarize the situation in very generic terms, Senator Graham said that Donald Trump was a terrible man who would be a truly horrible president.
I'm not going to try to get into the mind of Donald Trump because I don't think there's a whole lot of space there. I think he's a kook. I think he's crazy. I think he's unfit for office.
But then Donald Trump was elected president anyway. And in the aftermath of that, Lindsey Graham completely changed his perspective. He started saying that Trump was actually a great man who would be a great president, and Graham would do everything in his power as a US senator to help him implement his agenda. That is still Lindsey Graham's position to this day. Now, it is very easy to be cynical about why Lindsey Graham made this pivot, but according to Senator Graham himself, he did it because he was deferring to democracy. Trump was elected, and under the principles of democracy, anyone who wins an election is morally in the right.
He is President of the United States. He beat me like a drum, and I want to help him where I can because there's a lot on this man's plate, and we should all want to help him.
What have you learned about him that makes him different and more someone you want to work with and can work with than he was when you said he was unfit for office and quite possibly a kook?
Yeah, I said everything. I said he was a xenophobic, race-baiting, religious bigot. I ran out of adjectives. Well, the American people spoke. They rejected my analysis, and he is now my president.
Respecting our democratic system means recognizing the validity of whatever leader that system produces, and respecting their right to pursue whatever agenda they want. And if you work for the government, this might entail having to go along with an agenda you previously considered wrong, but has now been endorsed by the people, meaning it would now be undemocratic to oppose. And so Lindsey Graham fell in line, believing his previous critiques of Trump were wrong because the public had rejected them, and that Trump was now a good guy because he had received the democratic endorsement of the public. All democracies have the capacity to elect bad leaders, but when we admit this, it does kind of undermine the logic of the system a bit. A big part of the reason why democracy is supposed to be better than other political systems, after all, is because the collective wisdom of voters is supposed to help screen out the truly bad candidates. And it's for that reason that democratic societies often struggle with the question of how much a bad leader who was legitimately elected can be opposed before it crosses the line into undermining the whole democratic system. No one wants to become Egypt, where in 2013 their democratically elected leader was overthrown in a military coup, supposedly because he posed a threat to democracy. But once you start using brazenly undemocratic means to save democracy, the whole situation has become completely morally incoherent. Of course, most democratic systems deal with this paradox by just not consolidating too much unilateral power in the hands of a single leader. Most mature democratic systems have a separately elected chamber of the legislature and independently appointed courts that enjoy equal democratic right to exercise checks and balances on the elected leader. Or, in other words, other parts of the government are explicitly given their own democratic mandate to keep an eye on the leader and question or reject some of his decisions if they think they are bad. And of course, most democratic systems also have some sort of mechanism allowing a bad leader to be peacefully expelled from office if he misbehaves too much. I would still rank this threat to democracy as medium, however, just because I think democratic culture has a pretty deeply ingrained bias towards giving a leader who wins an election a lot of trust and deference, even when a lot of people know full well he is going to be a disaster. I mean, even Hillary Clinton was briefly prepared to defer to Trump.
Donald Trump is going to be our president. We owe him an open mind and the chance to lead.
Paradox number 3 is a very old criticism of democracy that is now often associated with the 18th century Scottish intellectual Lord Wodehouse-Lee, namely, voting yourself money. Governments have access to a lot of money to fund the services they provide, which they get from taxes and tariffs and service fees and loans and other stuff. But in theory, there is nothing to prevent a democracy from just turning into an ATM for the voters. And by this, I don't mean just voting to raise taxes on other people in order to raise funds for programs that you personally benefit from or whatever. I mean literally just voting for politicians who are like, I will cut you a check for $1 million from the government treasury if you vote for me. And then the $1 million checks for everyone party comes to power and passes the $1 million checks for everyone act. This sort of plundering would obviously cause a government to collapse into bankruptcy in short order, which was Lord Wodehouse-Lee's whole point. He believed that the public had a certain greed that would inevitably set in, and once that greed took over, democracy would collapse. Democracy can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse from the public treasury, was how he put it in a famous quote that he might have never actually said. I'm gonna rate this particular threat as low at the moment, just because for all of the fiscal irresponsibility that democracies are in the world suffer from these days, we are thankfully not yet quite so cynical as to believe that government can or should function as our private piggy bank. Although we should all keep an eye on the UBI people. On a similar note, we have paradox number 4, the tyranny of the majority. Another very old critique of democracy. Tyranny of the majority is the simple mathematical equation that states if democratic decisions are decided by majority preference, then there is nothing to stop a majority of voters from consistently making decisions that impose cruelty and oppression upon the minority of voters. The classic joke is that democracy is a wolf and a fox voting with a chicken to decide who's for dinner. A more real-world example would be the southern United States during the segregation times. The region's white majority didn't like the black minority, so they voted for politicians who made life harder for black people, keeping them in segregated schools and making it illegal for them to marry outside of their race and all the rest of it. They even passed laws making it harder for them to vote, thereby stripping them of whatever little political power they had. And at the time, this was justified as being perfectly fair, according to the principles of democracy. The majority had its preference, and the minority had no right to complain because, you know, majority rules. These days, however, we understand that majorities can unleash horrendous human rights abuses upon minorities unless there are laws in place that explicitly recognize the equal worth of all citizens under the law, even when that means overriding the will of the majority. Another US example would be how in the 2000s, many states passed referendums denying gay people the right to marry each other, only for those referendums to then get overturned by the US Supreme Court on the grounds that the straight majority did not have a right to oppress the gay minority in this way. Even though all democracies basically now have civil rights laws to prevent legal discrimination against unpopular minorities, I would still say that this is a medium-level threat, just because the process of agreeing to recognize the rights of minorities, and especially new minorities, can often be quite slow, and is often only ever sorted out after a period of oppression at the hands of the voting majority. Paradox number 5. Voting based on vibes. So the whole principle of democratic government is that the people rule. But baked into that principle is an implicit assumption that the people take their duties as rulers seriously. If the people decide to stop caring, however,